okay, full stop.
That's it. End of podcast.
So I'm speaking again with John Wheeler, who has graciously offered to talk some more about what this is all about. And one of the things that occurred to me is that I think for some, maybe the search does really end, obviously. And what happens after the search is over seems to be, although it's a natural unfolding, there also does seem to be some practical sides to kind of looking into, well, okay, now that I'm not spending all this time and effort and money and whatnot on spiritual seeking, what's next?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I've got my experience of this, that was what I found was actually it was that question was resolved pretty easily, because for me, when I looked at that stage, the question came up: what do I do next, or what happens next? And actually, right away, I noticed that even the question itself was a concept kind of in reference to that the sense of conceptual I, and I kind of spotted that right away. And then I noticed the question is really, what do I do? Mm-hmm. And now that we've seen through that, we're not really putting the belief on that reference point of being a separate person. What I found was that the very question drops away. Now, where does that leave us? It leaves us here as what we've always been, and life is spontaneously functioning in the moment by moment. And the funny thing is, it's just as it always has before. So you see a body, you see a mind, you see circumstances unfolding, and you see life flowing naturally, spontaneously, in the presence of this, of who we are, let's say. So what I found is that part of it doesn't really need an explanation, or it doesn't need a program. It doesn't particularly need some kind of blueprint or model to follow, because it's simply life living. And, if we look away from our immediate situation into, like, the nature or the universe at large, or, those things are taking care of themselves quite naturally without this question of, what do I do next? Like the sun is shining, it's not thinking what do I do tomorrow, but there's a natural functioning. And so what I found was that with this emphasis off of the fictitious reference point of being a separate someone, that it leaves life expressing. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, all that needs to be seen. So the next thought will come, or the next situation will arise, and the body-mind responds according, to its lights and its capacities. Things turn out a certain way, or they don't, or, whatever, and perfectly fine is what I found. And so that was my insight on this, once we see who we are, and once we're no longer living through that artificial reference point, is the actual question can drop away itself.
Uh-huh. So even that question can indicate still maybe some mesmerization with the idea of a separate self.
Yeah, well, that's the way I just kind of noticed for myself that it was, kind of an old, just kind of a familiar concept, a way of looking, where, the mind would come up with this idea, what do I do, where do I go from here? And, once we've seen the basics of what we've, talked about in the other question and answer sessions that we did, once we've seen that basic position, what we will see is we will see through the validity of that question itself, because it is posed in terms of the of the separate self. What do I do next is clearly a thought, it's clearly a concept, it's in reference to that sense of the conceptual self. And what we can see now that's different, though, is instead of responding to that as if it's a legitimate, issue that needs to be understood, is that we can just see now that it's based on that erroneous reference point. I don't, like, for example, if, coming into the immediacy of this moment, we're breathing, the body's doing its functions, the senses are functioning, the mind is functioning. Those aren't calling for some kind of plan or knowledge where we have to say, well, how do I do that, or what should I be thinking or sensing or feeling? And yet, we can see that it is all going on quite effortlessly and intelligently. And sometimes people think that if we see who we are and this belief in the separate self idea is seen through, that somehow, life would come to a grinding halt, and I would be left like a jellyfish with, no spine, with no motivation and no reason to act, which is absolutely false, because, life is not being lived by the concept of a separate me.
Mm-hmm.
So all we're really doing is, we're not altering the normal flow of life, but through this investigation and through this understanding, we've removed the belief in the conceptual self-center and all of the identifications that are attached to that belief. So the reality and the belief is dropping out of the structures, leaving you as what you are, with all of the normal faculties still available for their use. And so life goes on basically without the problems. So it's not like we don't have choices and we don't have actions and we don't respond. All of that goes on as before, but we're not viewing life through all of these artificial concepts. And what I find, or what I've seen, is that it allows the functioning to be clearer, smoother, more direct, less problem, more problem-free, really.
Yeah.
So things come up, situations come up, relationships, work situations, stuff, things with the body, all these things, they come up, and the body-mind is functioning according to its intelligence as, part of the whole picture. There's really nothing particularly difficult or hard or something about that, because it's just happening naturally on its own. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that what I found is the question drops away. So we're no longer concerned about what do I do next, because we see the conceptual nature of the question, and the interest in the question just simply drops away. So here we are, and as we're doing now, just whatever is coming up.
Yeah.
Thinking, listening, sensing, talking, functioning, and it's all happening quite well.
And choosing.
Yeah, and the choosing, and all the... See, people, I think we often have a misunderstanding about non-duality. I see this very frequently, is that we hear these notions like there's nobody here, or there's no doer, or there's no person, and these are common pointers. So we often hear those and we misinterpret what that means. We think that means there will be no choices, or there will be no activities, or there will be no preferences or decisions.
Or responsibilities.
And all of those are absolutely false. All those things will go on, absolutely will go on, because that's what the brain and the mind and the natural intelligence is doing. So that's not the meaning of that. The meaning of it is that, yes, for example, there are choices or decisions or preferences, because again, that's just the way the pattern is functioning. But what we see is those things are not being done or being managed by this artificial reference point of the assumed separate person. So we're not getting rid of the choices or the doing or the preferences or the emotions or the reactions. We're not getting rid of any of that stuff. All of that is intact. We're just getting rid of this notion that they all refer to this independent conceptual entity who is doing it all, because that's what we've seen through is simply not present, And that doesn't impair the functioning, it just removes the needless suffering or the needless questions and doubts that are, sustained by that viewpoint. So, sometimes I've expressed it as life goes on exactly as before, with no change whatsoever, except the static in the mind around that artificial view of our identity subsides naturally.
Yeah, you talk about that static in the mind, and not long ago I heard it put that there's this kind of a constant hum of concerns, and that hum, in my view, certainly seems to be about an entity who has these concerns and feels that he or she must deal with them somehow, make things better or make things right if they're off or like that. Or, generate some better future than there's what is present right now. And all of that seems to be tied to this fictional entity that you were talking about.
Yeah, and even the question of what do I do next or how do I live is also part of the static, is part of the hum, is part of the conceptualizing. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that we understand. I feel that we understand this aspect, because all of the trouble and the questions and the doubts that we raise, around spirituality and these kinds of things, they are all sustained in that particular mechanism, that particular aspect. They're, all of those things are the thoughts and the concepts and the questions and the doubts, and I found that it was very, very important to have a clear understanding of what's happening there, because if we don't see that and we don't understand that, we'll be taking these problems to be valid, or we think that they're real, that that they need to have a response, and then the energy and thought and focus goes into those things, trying to work it out, trying to fix it, trying to become free of all of these things. But I think it's more important to examine the reality of that whole structure and see if what it is based on is true, because the point really is that all of that conceptual activity is all centered around and kind of fixated on the assumption of the existence of that separate defective person that my mind has told me that that's what I am. And so until we really address that and really see that very clearly, I found it's not really going to be much avail to be working on all of these kind of concepts and things. And so and many of the great teachers and the great traditions have encouraged us to not get involved in the self-centered concerns of the mind, but to look at the root of that as to what is the nature of that entity who is having these issues. And what we'll see is when we ask that question or we examine that, and this would be the next step, once we realize that these concepts are all of the self-centered concern and thinking, and we begin to investigate and look at who is having those, or who has the problem, who has the question, who has the doubt, we're going to see that that's for me. That's for that sense of me. And that's why it becomes imperative at that stage to really begin to look at the reality of that, the truth of that reference point. And I think we've talked about that before, but people often get hung up in the questions and the problems and the worries and the concerns instead of really understanding that all of those things are sustained by this continued assumption that the owner of all those things is true, or that's what I am. So I feel we should examine that, focus on the truth of that.
Yeah. And you and I talked once about the structure of interpretation. That there is apparently a structure of interpretation that the me consists in, so to speak. What is the me constituted as? And what I've seen about that is that the me is constituted as a structure of concepts.
Yeah, I mean, really, the me is just a notion, an idea, and it doesn't have any substance to it, because we have the idea of a me, and then in order to sustain that or to make that somehow substantial, the mind adds on all of these definitions to it. And you can see that very clearly if you look at, as we grow up from a child, a young baby or a young child has very limited kind of sense of identity and doesn't have a lot of personal problems, doesn't view itself as a seeker or as a problematic person, and those definitions come gradually to be added on to that identity or that sense of me after that kicks in at a certain age, and sometimes they say that's the age of 2 or 3 or something like that. So
seems to me that's the birth of language.
Yeah. I mean, language certainly sustains these sustains these definitions because they're usually verbal ideas. Like I am John Wheeler, for example, is a concept. That's not what I am.
Funny thing is, you say I am John Wheeler, and I say I am Charlie Hayes, but the common ground is I am, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we peel away the definitions, the accidental definitions, and we come back to that which is holding them all, in other words, you'll find that all these definitions are always about the I. And so we say I am Charlie Hayes, I am John Wheeler. Well, the John Wheeler or the Charlie Hayes label is accidental because it's obviously variable. So let's pull that away. Because, I may have other ideas like I'm a good person or I'm incomplete or I have low self-esteem, whatever that might be. So clearly the labels are coming and going. So we want to dive to the core of that and realize, what are all of these attaching to? And it's kind of like the the tail on a donkey, that game where you stick the tail onto the donkey. So you have all of these concepts pinned onto this, central idea, which is the sense of I am. And what we tend not to have done is to examine what is the nature of the I am. We leave that unexamined, and then we assume that all of these definitions constitute the I am. So, and that's why, and even all of the spiritual ideas and the things that we do in terms of seeking and in terms of spiritual knowledge and experience, these, as far as I have seen, are still dealing with the labels and the definitions which come afterwards. So we even want to strip away the spirituality and the teachings and all of these things that we studied and read and say, I want to look directly at what is the nature of this I itself. Now, that I turns out to have an interesting quality because one interpretation of it turns out to be the concept I itself, the I am concept. And what I have seen is that the labels and the ideas, they are in reference to that. They're in reference to the I am concept. So it's the I am concept that has the troubles and has the worries and has the problems. So then it drives us even one step deeper into this, which is, am I that concept? Is that I am concept, is that truly what I am? If it is what I am, then I've got all of these problems. I've got all of these definitions because they're attached to that. If it turns out that I'm not that concept, then it's a whole different story, and it may allow us to slip completely out of all of the conceptual limitations, and that's why it's so vital to investigate this at that level. So, instead of seeking enlightenment or seeking to get an understanding, or whatever people that tend to do, which is more in the conceptual part of it, it would be, I think, more worthwhile to be looking at who am I? What is my true nature? Because it may turn out that you don't need any of those things. I mean, if the non-dual traditions and the sages that we've heard about are speaking the truth, that you are that reality, then it's going to be clear that you don't need anything. You don't need any experiences or any spiritual states or anything like that. So rather than invest in all of that activity, I would say let's keep investigating, looking deeper into this nature of what is my true nature in relation to this conceptual sense of life.
I think this is a good follow-up to the last podcast where we talked about starting from the fact of an incontrovertible being that is inescapable. And then once that's kind of gotten down as the baseline, then if there's any residual, as we started out saying, well, okay, now that I got that my true nature is this empty, space-like being, then what's next for me?
Yeah, and that's why often this, I used to call it the part two. The first part is who are you, and that must be clear. It's very important. But even as that becomes apparent, which any of us who are looking, it must become apparent. In other words, the fact of who we are as we look at what that is. But what you might notice is the mind, out of its habit, out of its old way of viewing, will raise these doubts and questions. And however that sounds, and I see this all the time, but it's like, yeah, but how do I stay in it, or what do I do next? Or, yes, I've seen what I am, but, I've still got XYZ problem. And that's why this other aspect is also very important, because it gives us a way of understanding and responding to these residual doubts and questions that appear, that are generated in the mind. And if we don't understand what's going on with that, what I find is that we're kind of baffled, and we're constantly thinking that these issues are legitimate, and it draws the attention to them, and we're thinking that we need to work it out, and then we start subtly conceptualizing again and start imagining things like, well, I must not be there yet, and there's something that I need to do, and all of these things, we swallow them kind of whole without realizing that, without seeing this kind of mechanism of what's happening, that's why I do think that it is important that we have this discussion, because if this is seen and we understand the conceptual nature of the suffering and its reference to the fictitious me idea, and then in a clear looking see that is in fact not what I am, then in that we step completely through all of those issues and resolve them, and they are taken care of, and they will not trouble moving forward, because there's that understanding of what's going on. If this is not seen, then any number of these questions will keep popping up in the mind. What about this? What about that? And that's the infamous what? Yeah, but, or I see that, but, and so I feel that it's important that this is understood, and that's why it's good to talk about it and look at it.
And to really nail down what is the mechanism of suffering, yes?
Yeah, and otherwise, it'll be, I know what I am, but, and then there'll be some question. Now, once, so there's nothing preventing us from understanding exactly what we're talking about, and then realizing, oh, all of these questions and problems are simply in relation to that conceptual self-center. That's not what I am. I am not the concept I am. I am that which is aware of that concept. And that which is aware of the concept right now doesn't have any problems. It's not trying to get to reality. It's not trying to get enlightened. It's not trying to live life a certain way. It doesn't have anything like that. It's just the pure, unchanging, unconditioned reality itself. And so we come back to something we talked about before, which is, taking our stand as that.
Yeah.
And you'll find that it takes care of all of these yeah buts and these questions and problems, because there simply is no problem for what you are. It's just it turns out to be the stunning, amazing fact is that being has no personal problems, because it's not a person. It's not a conceptual entity. So this was the second, major piece of this thing that was shared with me that allowed me to actually resolve the seeking and the questions. And I think without this piece understood, no matter what else that we may have understood or experienced, that sense of getting strung out in the mind tends to carry on.
Yes.
Now, seeing this and understanding what we're talking about, which is not difficult at all, but we can see it now, but you'll find that all of these questions have the same resolution. And it's like if you just recognize this globally, understand kind of what's going on, you'll find that you don't have to resolve all of the particular questions. So
because they're all based on one core misconception of being a separate entity, yes?
Yeah, so even that, so now we can appreciate why if we say, okay, what do I do next? Or how do I live my life? It's just instantly recognize that for what it is.
Yeah.
It's just an idea coming and going, and it's not relevant, in the deepest sense to the fundamental truth of what you are, because your true nature is not worried, or it's about what do I do next. That worry is a thought, and that worry is in reference to the conceptual I. And since that's not who you are, it's not about you. It's not really a legitimate issue for your natural being. And so this was a very key aspect. And so what was pointed out to me was first and foremost, who and what are you? And see the truth of what your nature is. And I do feel that that's the most critical piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this understanding of what generates the residual questions and what's at the root of that. And the understanding and seeing of that dissolves the identification with that, thoroughly dissolves and resolves all of those problems. So then we're left here. We come back as to what we are, present and aware in the natural state of being without the concept. Right?
Yeah.
And that's where we see something that people often wonder about. We see the being, and we see this aware, awake nature. And then we also notice that without the conceptualizing, there's a peace there. There's a fullness there, or a joy, or a harmony. However you want to point to that. And that's the Sat Chit Ananda that they used to talk about: being, awareness, and the full, deep peace of nothing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you are. That's where you must live and abide, because it's the natural identity of what you are that can never be lost. And it was only the imaginary conceptualizing that became that static, or that hum in the mind that was constantly kind of spinning there. And we just looked to that out of ignorance. We didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us tried to figure things out in this, try to get the answers in the mind and to arrive at some conceptual structure that made sense or was some truth, but then getting sucked right back in because the core wasn't examined.
Yeah, and even again, I've said this a few times, but these things that we do often in the name of spirituality, once we understand from this perspective, we will see that they are also being sustained in that false perspective, and that often shocks people and is often unexpected, because often when we're suffering, we are instinctively doing all kinds of things to try to address that. We're meditating, we're becoming still, we're going to satsangs, we're studying, we're going to India, we're hoping to get transmissions. We're doing all kinds of things, and we're hoping that these things are going to be the answer. And so when you hear this kind of perspective, and it may start to dawn on you that a lot of those things themselves are still being generated through the erroneous perspective, that often kind of comes up where at first people might not want to acknowledge that. Well, that this is the answer. This is what I'm doing is the answer. And there's nothing that we can do to change somebody's mind or something like that, because it's just something that they have to look at and sit with and in their own experience come to realize whether in fact that is the answer or not.
Well, and certainly this flies in the face of what I like to call the consensus reality, the paradigm of what it is to be human certainly does not include the simplicity of these points. What if we take it out of the domain of spirituality altogether and just put it in the domain of being human? Mm-hmm. Then we have, because my observation is that people at work, people that work in stores, people that work in offices, people that don't work, that are retired, just human beings all share these essential concerns about me. And, whether they're spiritual seekers or not, is really irrelevant, isn't it? I mean, this is kind of universal, isn't it?
Yeah, well, even the idea of a spiritual seeker is just a label or a definition. So I mean, I think we're just talking about the way it is, the way life is. I mean, if we take it out of the conceptual problem, I mean, without looking at it from a spiritual, perspective, so to speak. I mean, what we're just seeing here is we're seeing this presence of life functioning moment by moment. So the sensing and the feeling and the expressing is all erupting, as a natural outflow of this conscious life essence that we are, and those patterns are arising and they're setting and they're interacting, and the universe is simply unrolling moment by moment, and really from a global perspective with a marvelous intelligence and a deep underlying harmony, because there's really nothing outside of this one intelligence, this one essence of life. And if we could pause there and simply see life from that perspective, this is what we see. We see this marvelous play of life that is constantly bubbling up out of the center and resolving back into its essence. And there's not anything wrong, there's nothing defective, there's no separation, there's no division at any time. So, this is not just for me or you or, a spiritual seeker. This is for, everything in the appearance is simply the display of this.
Yeah.
And then we'll see that, if the conceptual idea has kicked in of this imagined separation, then there begins this sense of seeking and searching to try to resolve that, and then people, are engaged in all kinds of pursuits, to try to address that in all different kinds of ways, and it doesn't have to be overtly spiritual. It can be, any manner of things, and that's also part of the, expression.
Yeah. One of the things that occurred to me is that I can remember back when I was about 3 or so years old, and having a traumatic situation happen with my older sister, and there was a decision made, almost like a sentence, like a judgment. Like the judge made a sentence, and whether you were innocent or guilty, you were sentenced to life in this prison of this concept, and the concept was something's wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's at the core for an awful lot of people. Something's wrong with me, and I'm not good enough to fix it. And it's a kind of malaise that goes with that. And a friend of mine and I were having an interesting discussion about, he was talking about how depression and that kind of thing can be chemical imbalance. And although I think that's valid, I also, the inquiry that I kind of like is, okay, is the chemical whatever a product of interpretation, or is the interpretation of something wrong a product of the chemistry, or which came first, the chicken or the egg? And this may be a little afield from what we were talking about, but it seems to be one that a lot of people have this core assumption out of the assumed separateness of me that something is definitely wrong here.
Well, I like to look at it from a broad perspective so that we can, kind of handle it and kind of have a practical response. And it's the way that I would look at this is that the moment that the idea of separation is conceived in the mind and believed, there's an instant feeling of something wrong there. There's a limitation, because you suddenly have yourself and everything other than myself. I suddenly feel isolated and small and somehow defective, and I would agree that that gives rise to a kind of a felt sense that there is something wrong here. If this concept of the separate me simply came up and it had no impact and it didn't create any sense of limitation, nobody would be concerned about examining it. There would be nothing wrong. It would just be, it's just a thought, and I'm still what I am, and everything's fine. But it does bring in that sense when it's believed or identified with. It brings in that sense of something is wrong, or a sense of suffering, or lack of ease, or whatever. And now the interesting thing is that we're going to unwind this, by coming back and examining the basic assumption to see if that idea that was taken on board, innocently, whether in fact it was true or not. And so that's what we can do now, and we don't have to try to, cut through all of the years of concepts and conditioning or whatever. We really just have to go back and examine in the light of our awareness what is the reality of that assumption. And what we'll see is that it's not even a matter of making that concept go away, because, here we are speaking about I and you and I am, and we're using all of these symbols and words and things like that. But it's just a knowing, it's a recognizing as to whether that constitutes my identity or not. And so it's not, what you find is that it's not even that I am concept inherently that is a problem. It's really just a belief or an unexamined notion that I am that. Now, in the investigation and in the looking at this, it becomes clear that that's not what I am. And just that seeing right there, just that understanding right there, what it does is it takes the belief off of the concept, and without the belief going into that concept, the issue, the root of the static, it's resolved there. So we're not fighting with the mind. We're not trying to annihilate the ego and struggle with all these things, which would be way too much work and wouldn't be effective. Because who's doing that and why? But there is a seeing, there is an understanding that's available where the natural intelligence simply alights upon that and sees the truth of whether that equation is true, that my being is that concept. And that's, so this whole investigation of suffering, when it's looked at this way, kind of step by step, and you get down to the core of it, what the final looking, the final thing that is seen there is whether or not I'm that concept, that simple, because if I'm not that concept, then all of those other concepts that depend on that, they are no longer my definition.
Yeah, it takes the validity away from them, doesn't it?
And that's, I think it's very, very important, though, that when we've preceded this by this recognition of the truth of who I am, that's kind of waiting there as your already felt and recognized experience. In other words, I can now see when the belief comes off of that concept that I'm still here, present and aware as the natural state of what I am. And, I don't have to, it's not like I'm somehow, when I examine that concept, that somehow I'm, left in this undefined or kind of unknown state or something that I don't know what's going on, because I already have that recognition of my true being.
Right.
So this is what I found allows this investigation of the I to be successful, because I can take it right down and see the reality of that, and in that final just little examination, it can naturally fall away, allowing me to simply be what I am.
And what we always were.
So, and if that part's a little unclear, what happens is that the investigation itself can somehow get distorted through these self-centered ideas. Like, I'm investigating, and I want to get free, and am I doing it right, and how do I do it, and all of these concepts.
Yeah, am I doing it right? That's a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, I had a fellow write to me the other day, and he said, he was saying that I was pointing to this awareness and this stuff like that, and then he said, well, yeah, but I want to know, how do I see that, or how do I get there, kind of thing.
Right.
And, I had to go back and just really be very, very direct and simple and say, well, the question is not needed. You are present. You are aware. It's already established. The truth of that is self-evident. There is no need for a question. And so even those kind of subtle spiritual questions like that are also just part and parcel of that conceptual mechanism, and we don't want to give them any, substance or reality. They are not valid questions. How do I see the awareness? How do I do the investigation? How's it going to work? Am I there? All of these things. None of these things are valid at all.
Because the premise is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the age-old thing that we probably heard or read about when people would say, but who's asking the question? And it's really a way of short-circuiting the conceptualizing and getting us back to the important point here, which is, above all else, have a look and be clear on what you are. Don't even worry about all these questions.
Right.
Your being is here. What you are is doubtless. There's nothing, tricky about that. And, if the mind says, yeah, but this, what about that, and all these self-centered thoughts.
It reminds me of something that I think was attributed to Benjamin Franklin, who said, the truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is. And it's shining in plain view.
Yeah. Yeah, and you've had a good understanding, and the insights that you shared about this are very clear. And I don't know, maybe perhaps you have your own experience or take on this. I mean, I'm kind of saying it in a way that, in my terms, or kind of how I would express this. But maybe perhaps you could say a few words on how you saw this kind of same subject here that we're trying to investigate.
Well, one of the things that I realized is that the I concept is it doesn't actually point to anything with any substance, and it's just a thought that comes and goes. I am. It's just and one of the things that came really crystal clear is that I'm not any appearance. That what I am, what people are, what everyone is that to which the appearances appear. Mm-hmm. And that nothing that comes and goes could actually fit the definition of the natural reality that we are.
Yeah, so then you see, when all of these troubles and concerns and issues, who are they for? See, I think that's if I say that I'm not that I don't have an understanding, or that I'm missing something, or I'm incomplete. So the question really is, and I think we can see that now, is who is that one who has that quality?
Yeah, who is making that claim?
Exactly.
Yeah, and another thing I saw is that it's kind of a funny thing to say, but we talk about not being whole and complete. You can't have not whole and complete without the other side of it, which is whole and complete. Mm-hmm. You can't have not something that isn't.
You can't have a lack of something. You can't possess a lack of something.
Exactly.
Like if you look at your sense of being, or that awareness as it's often pointed to, is that halfway present? Is your being only half here? So that's the same type of thing. What we're pointing to, it doesn't really come into this thing of being partially existent or something. I'm only half of my existence is here. Yeah.
It's all very oxymoronic. So that's how I see it. And one of the things that I appreciate about the expressions that you offer is that you don't try to not say I and, to some contrived sense of, well, the way it is seen here. No, it's just the I, the me. I mean, these are pronouns that are perfectly appropriate to use in language to communicate, all the while knowing that they don't point to who we are.
Exactly. Just like you use your name, Charlie, I use my name, John, for practical purposes, and whenever I need to sign my name or talk to somebody, that comes up, but I'm not confused or somehow think that I am the name.
Yeah, I don't think that my landlord would accept a check if I signed it no one.
Yeah. So, and so we don't have to try to do an artificial dance around, I'm not the name John Wheeler, therefore every time that comes up in conversation I've got to do this kind of funny, advaita dance to let everybody know that I know that I'm not that. I mean, it's kind of silly. So,
yes.
We just use these names and words and expressions, and we use them well and accurately because, why not? I mean, they're just part of the intelligence and stuff, but we're not making the false assumption of equating identity to be those concepts. And so I think that's why when you actually hear something like somebody says it's happening to no one and all these artificial things, it's actually kind of a sign that this still there's a kind of a conceptual thing going on where you're almost trying to posture by showing, look at me, I don't have to use, the concept or something like that, or I, but it's just, it's just too artificial.
Well, it's a pretense.
Yeah, so there's a kind of a pretense quality, and that's why I try to avoid those things. I mean, because it gets old, It's happening to no one, and
it doesn't serve, the sincere person who really wants to get down to the core of this. It doesn't serve them to play those games.
Yeah, it's just because if we're more natural and just point out and basically say, hey, look at these basic points. Can you see what's being pointed to? Do you have any particular question? And just take it like that, And then what we'll find is that people tend to be able to follow along, and then they see it for themselves, and then they don't need the pointers. They don't need to be looking at these things because they have verified the truth of them, and that's what I think this is all about in the end. It's not about anything more than sharing this natural and available experience. Just, I would say, for its own value, for the inherent value of, just like that suffering and separation was needless and artificial and could be resolved, and that, is inherently a good thing. It feels, spontaneously as a truth. I mean, that's something that is worthwhile. And then the sharing of that with any other appearance, anybody else that's interested, is on its own terms, is also inherently worthwhile. It's not because, of any other reason than just the inherent value of that.
And it's just a natural self-expression.
And that's why I think, what I found is that at that stage you realize why it's so important that all of the emphasis goes off of the teacher, the level of understanding, and all of these kind of trappings and all of the verbiage around the spirituality. This is not about teachers. It's not about particular traditions. It's not about what anybody knows or doesn't know. It's about the message. It's about that which is being pointed to. And what I find is that, if we are following along with this, the person doing the pointing and the assumed seeker that is being investigated, they fall out of the picture, pretty rapidly. And we're not left with a teacher and a seeker or somebody that has any particular status. We're left with just the kind of the basic reality itself, and I think it's important that that is the emphasis. I heard Sailor Bob say one time, it's not about the messenger, it's about the message.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I found, and which was very helpful, was that in the way that he presented it, it was always constantly going back to the message or the essence itself. Very little or no energy going into anything other than the heart of the matter. And I think that what happens with that is it allows us to focus on that and to see that without getting distracted in all kinds of things. I mean, many things in spirituality are completely irrelevant. I mean, they're absolutely secondary distractions. See, in this whole discussion, that we've had today, we've never talked about, getting enlightened or achieving some state or anything like that. We're talking about something much more basic.
It's immediate and it's simple.
People sometimes talk about, getting awakenings, getting certain insights, and then progressing and going down a certain path and eventually arriving and all those things. But, who's doing all that? and why are they doing all that when you are that unconditioned reality itself now? It's kind of, so we can step outside of a lot of those things that people get hung up in by sticking, with the fundamentals of this. We're never going to be talking about when you get there and the stages and who has it and who doesn't. All those things are pretty irrelevant to this.
No, it's already always here now, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the simplicity and the immediacy and the incontrovertible nature of the truth of what we are, when that's seen, well, where's the seeker? The seeker is just not there anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been really, really wonderful, and I want to wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. Perhaps we shall meet again in this way in the next week or two, and we shall see. So thank you very much, John. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Charlie. Nice to talk to you again.